The storm raged against the longhouse walls as Maria Baker pressed herself against the cold stone, watching the massive Viking warrior pace before the dying fire. His scarred hands trembled not from the cold, but from something deeper. Peter Martin had just returned from a raid that had gone terribly wrong, and she could see the weight of lost men crushing down on his broad shoulders. The other women had fled when they heard his ship's horn echoing across the fjord, but Maria remained, drawn by something in his eyes that spoke of pain rather than violence. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden shutters, carrying with it the scent of snow and distant smoke. Peter's massive frame cast dancing shadows on the walls as he moved, his weathered face etched with lines of grief she had never noticed before. When he finally stopped pacing and sank onto the wooden bench, his head falling into his hands, Maria felt her heart clench with unexpected sympathy. This was not the fearsome raider the village spoke of in whispers, but a man drowning in the weight of command and loss. She took a tentative step forward, her bare feet silent on the rushes scattered across the floor. The firelight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and she could see the way his shoulders shook with each labored breath. Without thinking, she reached out to touch his arm, but stopped herself just short of contact. The space between them felt charged with unspoken understanding, a recognition of shared suffering that transcended their different worlds. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. But this moment of connection had been months in the making, born from circumstances that had brought them together in the most unlikely of ways. It had all begun with the autumn raids, when the Norse ships had swept down from the northern seas like wolves descending on unsuspecting prey. Maria had been tending to her small garden behind the monastery when the first screams reached her ears. The sisters had taken her in years ago when her parents died of the fever, and the quiet life of prayer and service had suited her gentle nature. She was known for her skill with healing herbs and her way with frightened animals, traits that made her invaluable to the small religious community nestled in the valley. The sound of splintering wood and shouting men shattered the morning peace like a stone through glass. Sister Janet King burst through the garden gate, her usually composed face wild with terror. The Vikings had come earlier than expected, and there was no time to flee to the hidden caves in the hills. Maria dropped her basket of herbs and ran toward the chapel, where the other sisters were gathering the sacred relics and what little gold they possessed. The great doors of the monastery exploded inward just as Maria reached the main hall. Through the shower of splinters came the raiders, their axes gleaming and their voices raised in fierce battle cries. But it was their leader who drew her attention, a giant of a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire space. Peter Martin moved with deadly grace despite his size, his pale eyes scanning the cowering nuns with an expression that was more calculating than cruel. The other raiders began grabbing whatever they could carry, but Peter raised his hand and they stopped immediately. His authority was absolute, and Maria found herself studying his face for clues to his intentions. There was intelligence there, and something that might have been restraint. When his gaze fell on her, she felt a strange jolt of recognition, as if she were looking into the eyes of someone she had known in another life. The negotiations were brief and conducted in a mixture of Norse and broken Latin. The monastery would be spared complete destruction if they surrendered their treasures and provided supplies for the raiders. But Peter's eyes kept returning to Maria, and she sensed that her fate was being decided in those long moments of silence. When he finally spoke her name, somehow knowing it, though they had never met, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The decision came swiftly. She would come with them, not as a slave, but as something more valuable, a healer who could tend to their wounded and sick. The other sisters wept as she gathered her few possessions and her precious collection of medicinal herbs. Mother Superior Karen Rogers pressed a small wooden cross into her hands, whispering prayers for her protection. But as Maria walked toward the waiting longship, she felt less like a captive than like someone walking toward an unknown destiny. The journey north was a revelation in itself. The other captives huddled in the bottom of the ship, seasick and terrified. But Maria found herself drawn to watch Peter as he commanded his crew. He never raised his voice, yet every man obeyed him instantly. She noticed how he checked on the wounded first when they made camp, how he ensured the weakest among them had enough food before taking his own portion. These were not the actions of a mindless savage, but of a leader who understood the weight of responsibility. The Norse settlement sprawled along the edge of a deep fjord, its wooden buildings clustered around a great hall that dominated the landscape like a sleeping giant. Smoke rose from countless hearths, and the sound of hammers rang out from the smithies where weapons and tools were forged. It was larger than Maria had expected, and far more organized. This was not a temporary raiding camp, but a thriving community, with children playing in the streets and women tending gardens much like her own. Peter's longhouse sat apart from the others, positioned to overlook both the harbor and the mountain passes beyond. It was here that Maria was given a small chamber of her own, furnished with simple but well-made furniture and a window that looked out over the water. The gesture surprised her, as did the respect with which the other members of the household treated her. She was not a prisoner here, but something closer to an honored guest. Her skills as a healer were put to immediate use. The raid that had brought her here had not been without cost, and several of the warriors bore wounds that needed tending. Maria worked with quiet efficiency, using her knowledge of herbs and her gentle touch to ease their pain. She noticed that Peter often stood in the doorway watching her work, his expression unreadable but intent. It was during these first weeks that she began to see past the fearsome exterior to the man beneath. Peter would often sit by the fire in the evenings, staring into the flames with an expression of deep melancholy. Sometimes she would catch him looking at a small wooden carving that he kept in a leather pouch, his scarred fingers tracing its surface with infinite care. When she asked about it, he showed her the figure of a woman holding a child, carved with such skill that she could almost see them breathing. His wife and son, he told her in halting words, taken by the fever 3 winters past. The same fever that had claimed her own parents, Maria realized with a start. They had both lost everything to the same cruel disease, though their responses had been vastly different. Where she had sought solace in prayer and service, he had turned to raiding and conquest, trying to fill the emptiness with action and purpose. The revelation changed everything between them. No longer was he simply the Viking chieftain who had taken her from her home, and she was no longer just the Christian healer who tended his men. They were two souls who had walked through the same dark valley of loss and emerged scarred, but somehow still breathing. In the long evenings that followed, they began to talk, sharing stories of their lost loved ones and the dreams that had died with them. Maria learned that Peter had not always been a raider. Before the fever took his family, he had been a trader, traveling the northern routes and building relationships with distant settlements. The wooden carving had been made by his own hands during the long winter nights when his wife was heavy with their child. He had imagined a future filled with laughter and growing children, never dreaming that death would steal it all away before his son had seen 2 summers. The transformation in their relationship was gradual but unmistakable. Where once Peter had been a distant figure of authority, he became someone Maria looked forward to seeing each day. He would seek her out in the herb garden she had planted behind the longhouse, asking questions about her work and listening with genuine interest to her explanations of which plants could ease pain and which could fight infection. In return, she began to understand the complexities of leading a Norse settlement. Peter showed her the careful balance required to keep his people fed and safe through the harsh northern winters. The raids were not acts of random violence, but calculated expeditions to gather the resources needed for survival. Every decision he made carried the weight of dozens of lives, and she could see how that responsibility had aged him beyond his years. The other women in the settlement watched this growing friendship with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Donna Rodriguez, the blacksmith's wife, was the first to approach Maria directly about the situation. She was a practical woman with calloused hands and a direct manner of speaking, and she wasted no time in getting to the point. The chieftain had been alone too long, she said, and his interest in the Christian healer was becoming obvious to everyone. But it was not disapproval that Maria heard in Donna's voice, but something closer to hope. Peter had been like a ghost since his family's death, going through the motions of leadership, but lacking the fire that had once made him a natural leader. In Maria, Donna saw the possibility of healing not just for Peter, but for the entire community that depended on his strength and wisdom. The first real test of their relationship came with the arrival of Edward Moore, a rival chieftain from the eastern settlements. He had come ostensibly to discuss trade agreements, But Maria could see the calculation in his cold blue eyes as he surveyed Peter's holdings. Edward was younger than Peter, unmarked by the kind of loss that had scarred the older man, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never truly been tested. The negotiations took place in the Great Hall, with the leading men of both settlements gathered around the long tables. Maria was not included in these discussions, but she could hear the raised voices and feel the tension that seemed to permeate the very walls. Edward's demands were excessive, his tone increasingly aggressive as the days wore on. He wanted access to Peter's best hunting grounds and a share of the profits from the southern trade routes. On the third night of Edward's visit, Maria was tending to a sick child in the village when she heard the commotion from the great hall. Shouts and the sound of overturning furniture sent her running toward the longhouse, her heart pounding with sudden fear. She arrived to find the two chieftains facing each other across the hall, their hands on their weapons and their men forming hostile lines behind them. The confrontation had been building for days, but the final trigger was Edward's suggestion that Peter was too old and too soft to lead effectively anymore. The younger man's eyes had fallen on Maria as he spoke, and his meaning was clear. Peter's attachment to a Christian woman was seen as a sign of weakness, a betrayal of the old ways that demanded strength above all else. The tension in the great hall was thick enough to cut with a blade. Edward Moore stood with his legs spread wide and his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his pale eyes glittering with malicious amusement. He had pushed the confrontation to this point deliberately, Maria realized, testing Peter's resolve in front of both their men. The younger chieftain's followers shifted restlessly behind him, their faces eager for violence. Peter remained perfectly still, but Maria could see the coiled energy in his massive frame. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods over the past months, and she knew that beneath his calm exterior, a storm was building. His scarred hands hung loose at his sides, but she noticed how his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet, ready to move in an instant. The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Maria found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the two men, but the future of everyone in the settlement. Edward's challenge had been carefully crafted to put Peter in an impossible position. To back down would be to show weakness, but to fight would risk everything he had built here. It was then that Maria made a decision that surprised even herself. She stepped forward into the circle of tension, her soft footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Every eye in the hall turned to her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. But she kept her gaze fixed on Peter, drawing strength from the warmth she saw in his pale eyes. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She addressed Edward directly, her words carrying the quiet authority she had learned from years of dealing with difficult patients and frightened animals. She spoke of the healing work she had done in the settlement, of the lives that had been saved and the suffering that had been eased. Her presence here was not a sign of Peter's weakness, she said, but evidence of his wisdom in recognizing that true strength came from protecting and nurturing life, not just taking it. The hall remained silent as she spoke, but Maria could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Some of Edward's men were nodding slightly, and she saw doubt creep into the younger chieftain's eyes. He had expected to face Peter's rage, not the quiet dignity of the woman who had become central to the older man's life. Her words had reframed the entire confrontation, transforming what should have been a test of physical strength into something more complex. Edward's response was swift and vicious. He dismissed her words as the babbling of a Christian slave who had forgotten her place. But even as he spoke, Maria could see that his confidence had been shaken. The men in the hall were looking at him differently now, measuring his crude dismissal against her thoughtful words. Peter had not moved, but his presence seemed to fill the space around him like gathering thunder. When Peter finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear him. He thanked Edward for his visit and his proposals, but declined them with a finality that brooked no argument. The Eastern chieftain could leave in the morning with his men and his ships, and he would be allowed to depart in peace. But if he ever returned with threats or demands, he would find a very different reception waiting for him. The morning of Edward's departure dawned gray and cold, with low clouds hanging over the fjord like a shroud. Maria watched from her window as the Eastern chieftain's men loaded their ships. their movements sharp with barely contained anger. Edward himself stood on the dock, his pale eyes fixed on Peter's longhouse with an expression that promised future trouble. Peter appeared at Maria's side, his presence as solid and reassuring as the mountains that surrounded their settlement. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the ships disappear into the morning mist. When the last sail had vanished from view, Maria felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. But she knew this was not truly the end of their troubles with Edward Moore. The confrontation had changed something fundamental in the settlement's dynamics. Where once Maria had been viewed as an outsider, a Christian woman tolerated for her useful skills, she was now seen as someone who had stood beside their chieftain in a moment of crisis. The respect in people's eyes was genuine, and she found herself being consulted on matters that went beyond her healing work. Donna Rodriguez was the first to approach her with a proposal that took Maria completely by surprise. The blacksmith's wife had been watching the growing relationship between Maria and Peter with keen interest, and she had reached a conclusion that she felt needed to be shared. The settlement needed a leader's wife, someone who could provide the kind of stability and wisdom that came from a true partnership. The suggestion left Maria speechless. In all her months here, she had never allowed herself to think beyond the day-to-day routine of her work and her growing friendship with Peter. The idea of becoming his wife, of taking on the role that his lost love had once filled, seemed both impossible and terrifying. She was a Christian woman in a pagan land, a healer among warriors, someone whose very presence challenged the traditional ways. But as the days passed, Maria found herself unable to dismiss Donna's words. She began to notice things she had overlooked before. The way Peter's eyes followed her movements around the longhouse. The careful attention he paid to her comfort and safety. There was something growing between them that went deeper than friendship or mutual respect, though neither of them had spoken of it directly. The truth came to her one evening as she worked in her herb garden, grinding dried leaves into powder by the light of the setting sun. Peter approached with his usual quiet step, carrying a wooden cup of ale and wearing an expression of unusual uncertainty. He had been thinking about Edward's visit, he said, and about the words that had been spoken in the great hall. What followed was not a declaration of love in the manner of the songs and stories, but something more honest and raw. Peter spoke of the loneliness that had consumed him since his family's death, of the way Maria's presence had begun to fill the empty spaces in his life. He did not ask her to forget her faith or abandon her healing work, but wondered if she might consider building something new with him, something that honored both their pasts and their hopes for the future. Maria's answer came not in words, but in the way she reached out to touch his scarred hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that spoke of acceptance and trust. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath as they stood together in the fading light. Two people who had found in each other something they had thought lost forever. The wedding preparations began immediately, though they bore little resemblance to the Christian ceremonies Maria had witnessed in her former life. Norse customs demanded a celebration that would demonstrate the union's importance to the entire community, and Donna Rodriguez threw herself into the planning with infectious enthusiasm. The blacksmith's wife had appointed herself as Maria's guide through the complex rituals and traditions that would mark her transition from outsider to chieftain's wife. The first challenge was the matter of Maria's dress. Norse brides traditionally wore family heirlooms passed down through generations, but Maria had no such connections to draw upon. It was Karen Moore, the settlement's most skilled weaver, who solved the problem by offering to create something entirely new. The dress would be woven from the finest wool, dyed in the deep blue of the northern sky, and decorated with silver threads that caught the light like stars. Word of the upcoming wedding spread through the settlement. Maria was surprised by the warmth of the response. She had expected resistance from those who might see her foreign faith as a threat to their traditions, but instead found herself surrounded by women eager to share their knowledge and experience. They taught her the songs that would be sung during the ceremony, the symbolic gestures that would bind her to Peter and to the community itself. The most meaningful gift came from an unexpected source. Carl Long, Peter's oldest friend and most trusted advisor, approached Maria with a small wooden box that had been carefully carved and polished. Inside, nestled in soft wool, was a silver pendant in the shape of a hammer, the symbol of Thor's protection. It had belonged to Peter's first wife, Carl explained, and Peter had asked him to offer it to Maria as a sign of continuity and acceptance. The pendant felt warm in Maria's hands, and she could imagine the other woman who had worn it, who had shared Peter's bed and borne his child. There was no jealousy in the gesture, only a recognition that love could take different forms and that honoring the past did not require abandoning the future. When Maria fastened the chain around her neck, she felt the weight of responsibility as much as the silver itself. The ceremony took place on the first clear day of spring, with the entire settlement gathered in the great hall that had been decorated with fresh pine boughs and wildflowers. Maria wore her new dress with pride, the silver threads catching the firelight as she walked toward the place where Peter waited. He had dressed in his finest clothes, a deep green tunic that brought out the color of his eyes and a cloak fastened with a brooch that had been his father's. The ritual itself was both foreign and familiar, combining elements that spoke to Maria's Christian background with traditions that reached back to the ancient Norse gods. They exchanged rings forged by the settlement's smith, spoke vows that promised partnership rather than submission, and shared a cup of mead that symbolized the joining of their separate lives into something new and stronger. When Peter lifted her hand to kiss the silver ring he had placed there, Maria felt a sense of completeness she had never expected to experience. This was not the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more enduring, a love built on understanding and mutual respect. The cheers that erupted from the gathered crowd seemed to shake the very rafters of the great hall, and Maria knew that she had truly found her home. The first months of marriage brought challenges that neither Maria nor Peter had fully anticipated. The daily reality of sharing a life was more complex than the romantic ideals they had cherished during their courtship, and both had to learn to navigate the delicate balance between independence and partnership. Maria's healing work continued to demand much of her time and attention, while Peter's responsibilities as chieftain often kept him away from the longhouse for days at a time. The settlement itself was changing as well, influenced by Maria's presence in ways both subtle and profound. Her herb garden had expanded into a proper healing center, where people came not just for treatment of injuries and illnesses, but for advice on nutrition and preventive care. She had begun training some of the younger women in basic healing techniques, sharing knowledge that had previously been confined to Christian monasteries and convents. Peter watched these developments with a mixture of pride and amazement. His wife had brought something to their community that he had not even realized was missing, a gentleness that balanced the harsh necessities of survival in their northern homeland. The changes were not just practical, but spiritual, as Maria's example encouraged others to look beyond mere survival towards something approaching flourishing. The first real test of their partnership came with the arrival of Stephen King, a messenger from the southern kingdoms who brought news that would reshape their understanding of the world beyond their fjord. The Christian kingdoms were organizing a coordinated response to the Norse raids, he reported, building alliances and gathering forces that would soon pose a serious threat to settlements like theirs. The news sparked heated debates in the Great Hall, with some arguing for preemptive strikes against the gathering Christian armies, while others advocated for negotiation and peaceful coexistence. Peter found himself caught between the competing factions, his own instincts for caution warring with the aggressive traditions of his people. It was during these discussions that Maria's unique position became both an asset and a source of tension. As the only person in the settlement who truly understood both worlds, Maria became an unofficial translator, not just of languages, but of cultures and motivations. She could explain the Christian perspective on the raids in ways that helped her Norse neighbors understand the fear and anger their actions had generated. At the same time, she helped the messenger Stephen King see past the stereotypes of Viking savagery to recognize the complex society that had developed in their isolated northern home. The breakthrough came when Maria proposed a radical solution that drew on her knowledge of both traditions. Rather than preparing for war or attempting to negotiate from a position of weakness, she suggested that Peter's settlement could become a bridge between the two worlds. They could offer their services as mediators and translators, helping to prevent conflicts before they began while building profitable trading relationships that would benefit everyone involved. The proposal was met with skepticism from many quarters, but Peter recognized the wisdom in his wife's words. He had grown tired of the constant cycle of raid and retaliation that had defined his people's relationship with the southern kingdoms, and he could see the potential for something better. The decision to pursue Maria's plan would require courage and vision, but it also offered the possibility of a future that did not depend on violence and conquest. The transformation of the settlement from a raiding base into a center of trade and diplomacy was neither quick nor easy. Many of Peter's warriors struggled to adapt to their new roles as negotiators and merchants, their skills with sword and axe proving less useful in the delicate work of building relationships with former enemies. Some left to join other chieftains who maintained the old ways, while others gradually embraced the opportunities that peace could provide. Maria found herself at the center of these changes, her ability to speak both Norse and Latin, making her invaluable in the negotiations that followed Stephen King's initial visit. She worked tirelessly to establish trust between the two sides, often serving as the sole conduit for communication when tensions threatened to derail the fragile peace process. Her reputation as a healer also proved crucial, as she was able to treat wounded soldiers from both armies, demonstrating through her actions the possibility of cooperation rather than conflict. The first formal treaty was signed on a crisp autumn day, with representatives from three Christian kingdoms joining Peter and his advisors in the Great Hall that had once echoed with war songs. The document established trade routes and mutual defense agreements, but more importantly, it recognized the legitimacy of the Norse settlement as an independent entity capable of peaceful coexistence with its neighbors. Peter's pride in his wife's accomplishments was evident to everyone who saw them together during the ceremony. He had always known that Maria was special, but watching her navigate the complex political currents with such skill and grace filled him with an admiration that bordered on awe. She had not only found her place in his world, but had helped to reshape that world into something better than either of them had dared to imagine. The success of the peace negotiations brought unexpected consequences, as word of the settlement's transformation spread throughout the northern lands. Other chieftains began to arrive seeking advice on how to implement similar changes in their own territories, while Christian missionaries came to study how Maria had managed to maintain her faith while fully integrating into Norse society. Among these visitors was Michael Rivera, a young priest whose scholarly interests had led him to specialize in the intersection of Christian and pagan traditions. He was fascinated by Maria's story and spent weeks documenting her methods and philosophy, creating what would become one of the earliest accounts of successful cultural integration in the medieval period. His writings would later influence church policy regarding the conversion of pagan peoples, emphasizing understanding and respect rather than forced submission. But it was the arrival of Janet King, now Mother Superior of the monastery where Maria had once lived, that provided the most emotional moment of this period. The older woman had made the dangerous journey north specifically to see for herself what had become of the young novice who had been taken away so many years before. What she found exceeded her wildest expectations. The reunion took place in Maria's herb garden, where the two women embraced with tears streaming down their faces. Janet King had expected to find a broken woman, perhaps surviving as a slave or concubine in a barbaric society. Instead, she discovered someone who had not only thrived, but had become a bridge between worlds, using her faith and her skills to create something entirely new and beautiful. The conversation between Maria and her former Mother Superior continued long into the night, as the two women shared the stories of their divergent paths since that terrible day when the raiders had come to the monastery. Janet King spoke of the rebuilding that had followed the raid, of the new defenses and the gradual return to normal life. But she also admitted that something essential had been lost when Maria was taken, a gentleness and wisdom that had been the heart of their small community. Maria, in turn, described her journey from terrified captive to respected leader, emphasizing the role that faith had played throughout her transformation. She had never abandoned her Christian beliefs, she explained, but had learned to see them as compatible with the Norse emphasis on honor, courage, and loyalty. Her God, she had come to understand, was large enough to encompass all peoples and all ways of seeking truth and meaning. The theological discussions that followed were complex and sometimes heated, as both women grappled with questions that had no easy answers. How could a Christian woman find happiness in a pagan marriage? Was it possible to serve God while participating in a society built on values that seemed to contradict gospel teachings? These were not abstract philosophical debates, but deeply personal questions that went to the heart of Maria's identity and choices. The resolution came not through argument, but through observation. Janet King spent several days in the settlement, watching Maria work and seeing the fruits of her labor. She witnessed the respect and love that the Norse people showed for their Christian healer, saw the way Maria's influence had softened some of the harsher aspects of their culture without destroying its essential character. Most importantly, she saw the happiness in Maria's eyes when she looked at Peter, a contentment that spoke of a life lived in harmony with divine will. When Janet King finally prepared to leave, she carried with her not condemnation but admiration for what Maria had accomplished. The younger woman had found a way to be fully Christian and fully Norse, to honor her vows to God while embracing the love of a pagan husband. It was a lesson in the flexibility and universality of faith that would influence Janet King's own teaching for years to come. The departure of her former Mother Superior marked a turning point for Maria, a final resolution of the conflict between her past and present identities. She was no longer the monastery novice who had been taken by Viking raiders, nor was she simply the Norse chieftain's Christian wife. She had become something new and unique, a woman who embodied the possibility of unity across the deepest cultural and religious divides. Peter, who had watched these reunions and conversations with quiet interest, understood the significance of what had transpired. His wife had not been forced to choose between her faith and her love for him, but had found a way to honor both. It was a lesson in the power of compromise and understanding that would guide his own leadership for the rest of his life. The settlement itself had been transformed by these encounters, becoming a place where different traditions could coexist and enrich each other. Norse warriors learned Christian prayers for healing, while Christian visitors adopted Norse customs of hospitality and honor. The fusion was not always seamless, but it was genuine and it was growing stronger with each passing season. Years passed, and the settlement grew into something that neither Maria nor Peter could have envisioned when they first met in the monastery so long ago. What had begun as a typical Norse raiding base had evolved into a unique community that served as a bridge between two worlds, a place where former enemies could meet and find common ground. The success of their experiment had attracted attention from across the known world, with visitors coming from as far away as Constantinople and Rome to study their methods. Maria's role had expanded far beyond that of a healer or even a chieftain's wife. She had become a diplomat and teacher, a living example of how faith and love could transcend the barriers of culture and tradition. Her influence extended throughout the northern lands, as other settlements adopted her methods for integrating different peoples and beliefs. The herb garden where she had once worked alone had grown into a school where young people from many backgrounds came to learn not just healing techniques, but the arts of negotiation and cultural understanding. Peter, too, had been transformed by their partnership. The grief-stricken raider who had once sought meaning through conquest had become a statesman whose wisdom was sought by kings and chieftains throughout the region. His reputation for fairness and his ability to find peaceful solutions to seemingly intractable conflicts had made him one of the most respected leaders of his generation. But those who knew him best understood that his greatest achievement was not political, but personal. The love he had built with a woman who had taught him that strength could be gentle and that true victory lay not in defeating enemies, but in making them into friends. The longhouse where they lived had become a symbol of this transformation, its walls decorated with gifts from grateful visitors, and its halls echoing with the laughter of children from many lands who had found refuge there. Maria had never borne children of her own, but she had become a mother to dozens of orphans and refugees, creating a family bound not by blood, but by love and shared purpose. On quiet evenings when the day's work was done and the visitors had departed, Maria and Peter would often sit by their fire and remember the journey that had brought them to this place. They would speak of the monastery where she had once prayed for a life of service, of the longship that had carried her away from everything she had known, of the moment when they had first looked into each other's eyes and seen not enemy, but kindred spirit. The wooden carving of Peter's first family still held a place of honor in their home, But it was no longer a symbol of irreplaceable loss. Instead, it had become a reminder that love could take many forms, and that the heart was large enough to hold multiple truths without contradiction. Maria had not replaced Peter's first wife, but had created something entirely new with him, a partnership that honored the past while embracing the future. As the fire burned low and the stars appeared in the northern sky, Maria would often touch the silver pendant at her throat and offer a prayer of gratitude for the strange path that had led her to this life. She had found her calling not in the quiet service she had once imagined, but in the complex work of building bridges between worlds. Her gentle heart had not been crushed by the harsh realities of Viking society, but had instead become the force that transformed it into something more humane and hopeful. The story of Maria Baker and Peter Martin became legend in their own lifetime, told and retold around fires throughout the northern lands. It was a tale that spoke to the deepest human longings for understanding and connection, a reminder that love could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances, and that even the greatest differences could be overcome by patience, courage, and faith. Their legacy lived on in the community they had built together, a place where the gentle heart of a Christian woman and the fierce loyalty of a Norse warrior had combined to create something beautiful and enduring that would inspire generations to come.